Hi, Sawyer. Here are some answers to your questions. 1. How did your upbringing in New Bedford and your experience at New Bedford High School influence your future career path and your attitudes towards happiness? I really first became interested in psychology when I was a high school student back at New Bedford High in the 90s. It was really fantastic to go to high school in New Bedford. I learned a ton. At the time, I was able to take AP biology classes and early psychology classes. It really got me excited about thinking about the field of social science and really prepared me ultimately for the kind of work that I do today. Second, some current seniors at New Bedford High School are experiencing stress and anxiety stemming from worries over COVID-19. How can a student manage their stress and work towards happiness in an environment where they don't have that much control, whether that be at school or at home? I think it's worth noting that feeling stressed about COVID-19, especially as a high school student, is kind of normative right now. In other words, it's the normal thing to be feeling. I think sometimes when we experience negative emotion or stress, we think that there's something wrong with us or that we're doing something wrong. But in a really uncertain, anxiety-provoking situation like COVID-19, feeling stressed out, experiencing negative emotion, that's a normal thing to be going through. So I think we need to really make sure that high school students recognize that it's okay to not be okay right now. That said, I think if students are going through stress and anxiety, there are lots of strategies they can use to navigate these things. One simple strategy we talk a lot about on the podcast is just the simple act of using your breath. The act of taking a few deep breaths really is a mechanism for shutting off your sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response that so many of us are experiencing right now. The simple act of taking a few deep breaths can turn on our rest and digest system, which allows us to de-stress just a little bit. A second strategy is really to not suppress or run away from negative emotions, but give them time to be there. On my podcast, I talk about meditation practices that can help us with experiencing negative emotions. One good one is a practice that's known as RAIN, which is an acronym for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. So in the practice, you take 5 minutes or so to sit down and recognize your emotions, whether that's frustration, sadness, anger, anxiety, and so on. You really take steps to allow those emotions to be there and sit with those emotions as they take their course. And then you do that through the I step, investigate, which is to sit there with your emotions and really pay attention to how they feel in your body. Notice what's going on in your body. And what the science shows is that emotions are like a wave. If you sit with them for a while, they're going to take their course. And that's when you do the final step, which is N, to nurture. Ask yourself, what can you really do to take care of yourself? Can you take something off your plate? Can you contact a friend or call a friend and really connect with somebody? Research shows that practices like RAIN can really reduce negative emotion over time, even in populations that are really suffering, such as first responders. So I think it's a great strategy to use when you're feeling a little anxious and stressed out. Number 3, on a similar note, how can someone strive for happiness when they may be constrained in other ways? For example, an adult working 2 jobs or someone who may be a caretaker for someone else. I think it's obvious that certain kinds of circumstances affect our happiness, but the science shows that they don't always affect our happiness in the ways we think. In other words, even the worst of circumstances don't force us to be unhappy. There are still actions that we can take to feel better. One of those actions is really trying to engage in healthy habits as much as possible. Take 3 minutes to, do a few deep breaths so you can regulate your stress and deactivate your sympathetic nervous system. You can also take time to, when you have a break, kind of connect with somebody that you love. There's lots of evidence that social connection is really important for our well-being, but can also be a strategy that we can use to build resilience, especially during times of stress. And so even in very difficult circumstances, it's worth remembering that there are strategies we can use to feel a little bit better. It doesn't often feel that way, but the science shows there are things we can do to feel better. Number 4, social media has been a useful tool for keeping students connected. However, the supervisor of clinical and behavioral sciences at New Bedford Public Schools says that social media can be a double-edged sword. How much time online is too much? When should a student unplug? My favorite strategies for dealing with social media in a way that's healthier come from the journalist Catherine Price. She has a lovely book called How to Break Up with Your Phone, where she argues that we don't need to break up with our phones per se, but we might need to take them to couples counseling. She advocates for a strategy that she calls WWW, which is an acronym for What For, Why Now, and What Else. She argues that every time you pick up your phone to use social media, you should ask yourself those 3 questions. First, what for? Why? What was I going on social media for? Was it to really connect with somebody directly? Was I bored? Was I feeling anxious? Like, did I have a purpose going on social media, or did it just happen? Second, why now? What was the trigger? Maybe you were looking for information, but maybe you were feeling something. Perhaps you go on social media more when you're feeling anxious or depressed or bored. Again, just notice what you're going on there for. And then the third question, which is perhaps the most important one, which is what else? This is the opportunity cost question. What else could you be doing rather than going on social media? Maybe this is a time when you could be connecting with somebody in real life. Maybe this is a time that you could be sleeping or even just being present, taking a few deep breaths. And so Catherine Price's work shows us that it's not necessarily how much time we're on social media, but it's how social media is making us feel. And so if we can take steps to use social media more mindfully, to really notice what it's doing to our minds, to our bodies when we use it, we can try to find strategies to use social media so that we can get the benefits from being connected without getting the drawbacks in terms of our mental health. Number 5, some New Bedford High School students struggled with the transition from virtual learning to in-school instruction. What makes a fertile environment for happiness? How much impact does environment have on happiness? Well, all the changes that students are going through right now are causing lots of uncertainty and lots of frustration. I mean, they're causing uncertainty and frustration for adults, right? So it makes even more sense that teenagers going through this would be feeling a little bit, off kilter. I think the evidence suggests that our environments and our circumstances matter for happiness less than we think, but there are things that we can do to promote environments that boost our well-being. One strategy I give my own students is to make sure that the rituals they're used to for starting and stopping their day are still present. What do I mean by this? Well, when we were going to in-school instruction before, there was a time when you left your house, like you kind of went from home mode into school mode. And I think virtual learning means that disconnect isn't really often there. And that can feel really confusing for students. And so I often advise students to set up some ritual. For students who are doing virtual learning, I often advise students who are doing virtual learning to set up some ritual to signal that you're starting the day. That can be as simple as when you're done using your computer or your tablet for a day, throwing a towel over it, or sitting in a new spot at home when you're at school versus when you're just home for the day. These simple little environmental changes can have a big impact on our learning and how we feel during time of school. Number 6, one New Bedford High senior said that the prevailing attitude in school, people have kind of just given up. They just want to settle for the bare minimum. How can students find more motivation? I think one way to find motivation is just to realize that we have control over our own thoughts and emotions. We don't think so. It can feel like our thoughts just come up naturally and our emotions are automatic, but there is much more control than we think, especially in a tricky situation. I like to tell my students about a parable that comes from Buddhist philosophy called the parable of the second arrow. It goes something like this. Buddha was talking to his students and asked his students, hey, if you're walking down the street and you get hit by an arrow, is that bad? And his Buddhist students said, yeah, that's pretty bad. And he went on to ask, well, imagine if you're walking down the street and you get hit by a second arrow. Is that even worse? And, Buddhist students said, yeah, that's much worse to get hit by a second arrow. Buddha goes on to note that the first arrow we can't often control in life. That's the circumstances. That's if we have to switch, to remote learning. That's if the pandemic rises up and so on. But the second arrow is our reaction to those situations. And Buddha goes on to note that the second arrow is always under our control. In some sense, it's the one we stab ourselves with. That's, if we, respond to going online learning with, giving up completely or settling for the bare minimum or not engaging in healthy habits or social connection that could make us feel better. I think what the parable tells me is that there's a lot of control that we have over this situation in terms of our response to it. It doesn't feel like it, but you really can take control over your emotions and thoughts if you have the right strategies. Number 7, switching gears to your course at Yale, Psych in the Good Life. Is there a place for similar courses at the high school level? I really hope there's a place for courses like my Psychology in the Good Life at the high school level, because I'm working with colleagues right now on a grant-funded project to bring this content to high school students. Any educators in New Bedford that want to learn more can go to psychologyinthegoodlife.com. It's a website where educators can sign up for the materials we've created so far and can be in touch to learn more about when we have new resources available. My hope is that providing this content to high school learners will allow them to learn some of these effective evidence-based strategies early on so they can put them into effect before they become older adults. Number 8, is it the responsibility of a school district to teach positive mental health strategies? How can school districts be promoting students' happiness? We've found at Yale that teaching students about strategies that they can use to promote their happiness is an effective way of improving students' mental health. We've now done a study on our online Coursera Science of Wellbeing class, and what we found is that students who take that class get a bump in their well-being at the size of around 1 point on a 10-point happiness scale. So it's not huge, but it's a significant bump that most of our learners receive. And I think this tells us something, that we can really be using school curriculum to teach strategies that can improve students' mental health, in some cases at scale. So I do really think it'd be great if New Bedford Public Schools could get classes like this on the books. And it would be awesome for me as a New Bedford High alum to have that be one of my classes too.